Welcome back to the Sika Strength, a new show brought to you by the Sika Strength app as always. Now, today we're looking at the rising star from Egypt, Abdo Yones or Abdo Yones. I'm not quite sure, and we won't find out now. A lot of people are asking about this one, which is actually kind of an annoying thing that influencers say sometimes. Like, tons of people are asking me about my new product, which I'm sponsored by, but Abdo doesn't sponsor us. But a lot of people are asking, what the F is Abdo doing in training? And I can tell you exactly what I think he's doing, and we're going to speculate here, this is basically general physical preparedness for weightlifting. So GPP is a thing that kind of came around or was solidified in terms of academically, mostly from the Soviets. It's basically physical preparedness. It's a thing that was very popularized in the West, in fairness to Louis Simmons, and powerlifting in that side of things popularizes quite a bit to the common man, was the idea of doing very broad, different physical things to train your traits. Now, they weren't the only people to do it, but in terms of solidifying it as an idea, this was definitely something that came about in the Western side as a result of translating some of those Eastern Bloc and those Soviet manuals. Now, what GPP, or general physical preparedness, is quite literally any physical trait that might in some way be involved for your sport. So speed, power, strength, balance, proprioception, mobility, flexibility, anything you can think of, visualization, literally any physical quality or anything you do that might be used in your sport is something you should train. Now, when we're doing weightlifting, obviously we're going to be getting into something that's super specific. Heavy snatches, heavy clean and jerks. Technically, even in weightlifting, front squats are GPP, back squats are GPP, even things like this, no contact, which crazy, no foot, 130 kilo power snatch. This is insane. Among the many insane lifts that Abdo has done, is technically GPP for weightlifting. Technically, anything that is not your sport-specific activity is GPP. Technically, all of S&C training is GPP for whatever sport you're doing. Now, what we want to do here is, because in weightlifting, we're doing these very specific movements and we're training in a very specific style of training where it's basically snatch, clean, jerk, some variation, pulls and squats. But then we lose out on a lot of maybe the unilateral specificity. We definitely lose out on the work capacity side of things, which is basically doing lots of work in a short period of time that demands a high amount of energy from you, so it allows you to train more often. If you've watched any of our videos in the last year, you'll have heard us talking about this ad nauseum for the average weightlifter. And then other ways of training this is specific muscles like isolation work, better range of motion, working on things like hip extension, hip flexion here, extension of his hips, engaging the glutes a little bit better, which is the most physio thing I could have ever said. Better glutes and rotator cuffs are asleep. But this is quite literally GPP for weightlifting. For an athlete as advanced as him, is just any of this stuff. Here's some core work, barbell rollouts. Anything like this is GPP. And for someone at his level, it's important for everyone. But for him, this could be the difference between 172 and 174 on the snatch. We're trying to eke out absolutely everything he can from his training, and some of this looks kind of silly. It's not going to hurt him, it's not going to injure him, it's just general physical preparedness, and it's so non-specific that it is quite useful for him in training.
When you look at a weightlifter like this, we're obviously looking at the very, very top level, right? International or elite level competitor. And people often think that when you get to that level, and you get to that level of training capital, coaching capital invested in you, the amount of training sessions you're doing every week, people become so specific. Like, he's probably up to 14 or 16 training sessions per week where he's doing snatches and clean and jerk. People often forget that the base of the pyramid is still made up with that GPP. They often forget that a vast amount of the year is still spent in more general training terms. And they often think that everything you're doing that's not a snatch or not a clean and jerk is going to be a waste of time. In fact, even at the elite level, most of the base of the pyramid is still going to be made up by things that are not necessarily singles with the snatch and clean and jerk. Owen mentioned earlier doing things like derivatives, progressions and regressions, doing complexes with the standard lifts is in some way GPP, but you really need to look at the training program in the broader sense of things to see just how much of your training year or your 4-year cycle is made up of preparing the body, preparing you physically and mentally to be able to get underneath those loads in competition. Interestingly, weightlifting as a sport tends to push people more into the physical bottlenecks than some other sports might. So because weightlifting is very, very specific in the event it's preparing you for, it's just a snatch, it's just a clean and jerk, 3 attempts at each, people tend to become physically bottlenecked far quicker than they would in some of the other sporting domains. If we take, for example, a field sport where somebody is going to be sprinting, they might have some level of physical strength demands where they have to be able to grapple someone or fend somebody off. They might also need to have good hand-eye coordination or foot and eye coordination. In weightlifting, we're really concerned with having appropriate mobility to get underneath the barbell, being able to produce a lot of force very, very quickly, and then being able to refine a motor pattern with really high level and effective technique. And when we approach all of those things or start to master all of those things, we really start to cut everything out here. When we're talking about a more amateur level lifter, so obviously Abdo in this case is elite international level, when we look at the average weightlifter in a standard gym who's training 3 or 4 times per week, the physical bottlenecks become even more apparent. And this is the reason why we see so many people stuck at an 80 kilo snatch and a 100 kilo clean and jerk, and then we tend to see another physical barrier at 100 and 120 or 100 and 130 with the snatch and clean and jerk. A lot of this is coming from an actual physical bottleneck. It's not necessarily that there's a different style of technique you have to use to be able to snatch over 100 kilos. It's not necessarily that there's a different way you have to approach 130 or 140 kilos on the clean and jerk. Much of what happens is people generally when they're training or generally when they're quite physically strong and physically fit, maybe coming from a different sport or just having done some previous training before, most people will be able to snatch to that level or clean and jerk to that level with a pretty standard level of physical preparedness. Essentially, what that initial 2 or 3 years of training does is just becomes a refinement of the technique. You're learning how to move the barbell a small bit better, but you're not necessarily crafting or moving your body in the direction of becoming a better weightlifter. Sure, you might get a bit stronger quads. Sure, your midline might become a small bit better at maintaining that integrity as you're catching the weights. But really what you're doing is just refining a motor pattern. In order to get through these bottlenecks, you have to go through periods of general physical preparedness. You have to bring up your squatting numbers, your pressing numbers. You have to spend time in an off season when you're not just snatching, clean and jerking. And this will allow you to go through those areas of bottleneck or what some people refer to as plateaus in training. Obviously then, when we make that comparison going back in the opposite direction now of amateur to elite or international level weightlifters, for Abdo, he must, in order to make the peak of that pyramid a little bit higher, he needs to build that base a little bit wider and a bit more integrity in the overall pyramid of things. And that starts with gaining better physical preparedness, bringing up all of those inherent values that are important for weightlifters. Maybe it's gaining some mobility, maybe it's gaining some core strength, maybe it's gaining a bit of work capacity. So the standard across those later sets in training sessions raises the overall kind of level within your training.
I like a lot of the exercises that he's doing there. Some of them might look a little bit quirky and they're ones we wouldn't use in particular, but some of the specific mobility pieces, the kind of rear delt stuff, the thoracic extension, even the hip extension, not really a fan of those usually. So typically we see athletics people doing those weighted step-ups, which I don't see adding much value in most cases, but they're certainly not derivative to people's performances. But it's definitely something that's very useful. The younger you are and the more talented you are, the more GPP you get from less variation. So for example, if you're 20 years old, you've been playing lots of sports before this, you've got a talent for weightlifting, that GPP will actually just be triples from the blocks or triples from the floors, technically general physical preparedness for weightlifting for you. However, if you're a master's lifter, if you're 40 plus, respectfully, you're not very athletically talented, or it hasn't shown itself yet, hey, you couldn't have. It might not. It might be in there. You need way more GPP to make up for those deficits. And even if you are athletically talented as an older lifter, you need basically GPP at the start of every training block. It's one of the hard yeses, I think, that are different for older lifters and younger lifters, is the more GPP you do at the start of a training block for masters lifters, the better that training block will go for you and the better performance you'll get in results at the end. So again, even things like this, no foot, absolutely ghetto blocks. Surely they could afford by now better blocks for him. But anyway, this kind of thing, these no foot snatches, like there's 155 kilo no foot snatch here, no foot power snatch. What is that about?
It's insane.
What is going on? This makes me realize just the kind of level we're at currently, which we're missing in terms of weightlifting, where we don't have a lot of characters like this, which we did have before. And I think this is important for weightlifting, and I hope there's more of them. And everybody knows what's going on everywhere. Everywhere. I cannot say it enough, everywhere. And I know you think, oh yeah, some of them are so talented. They are all talented, but it's everywhere. And I don't mind. I want to see let me see a 180 block snatch from a 73 kilo lifter, 75, whatever the fucking classes are now. Let me see.
The last thing I want to mention here is in relation to some of the more random exercises you see thrown in here. So obviously when we're building the base of that pyramid, we want a very general and broad idea of what's going on. And sometimes when we look at these exercises, they might be a bit bullshitty, for want of a better term, okay? Very random in terms of what's happening, extremely varied in terms of the movements. Like, why are you doing a floor press with a glute bridge at the same time? What we never want to do is we never want to discount, firstly, the value in just how general that movement is, but secondly, the very specific reason that might be being used. So it could be a coordination issue. It could also be that some of these movements have a little bit of an explosive element to them. It could also be trying to trigger those smaller tendons attached to those smaller motor units. Things like tendons in the back of the shoulders, tendons in the subscaps oftentimes become very aggravated over the course of long training blocks for weightlifters. The problem there is that they're not necessarily developing too much tendon strength. They're not necessarily developing too much integrity within the tendon, because that tendon is just really being used, or that muscle group is really being used just to stabilize the shoulders or just to stabilize the midline throughout the pull or when they're in the overhead position. So when we get to our off-season pieces and we start looking for areas where those little niggles or those small pain points might be occurring, whether that's the shoulders, the elbows, the forearms, wherever that is, having a small bit of explosive work in those areas to trigger a small bit more tendon adaptation could definitely be very valuable.
170 double snatch attempt. Come on. Give us a break. Give the other people a break, Abdo. What a lift. Okay, if you would like advice like this and you need help with your own training, if you sign up to the Sika Strength app at app.sikastrength.com in the link below, we will help you run a proper off-season for weightlifting. And then you will have access to us basically anytime you need help from us, because it's one of the most well-supported apps in the industry. Direct chat to the coaches here at Sika Strength. Darren and I, you get video feedback every month with the price of your subscription. You can access all your programs, 2 programs at once, which you don't have to do, but you can do, and you can, jeepers creepers, and you can switch between programs at any point in the link below. Hope you enjoyed today's video. If there's any news stories you'd like us to cover, leave them in the comments below.